Well, the 25 basis point cut for next week is pretty much baked in. The probabilities exceed 90% that the Fed is going to do this, continuing its policy that it started a few months ago of cutting interest rates because inflation was under control. But the question still out there, is inflation really under control? So there'll be a lot of attention paid to what the forecast and the statement by the Fed will be as to the future.
Well, we'll talk about the forecast later on, but as you've mentioned, how do the latest economic data, such as the steady US economic growth, the persistent inflation, which is hard to control or predict, as you've mentioned, and the resilient job market influence the Federal Reserve's monetary policy decisions?
Yeah, so here's the big picture discussion that is taking place now. As you know, the Fed has an objective of a 2% inflation number, and its policies have been driving towards that goal. The discussion today is whether 2% is realistic. And could we not live just as well with 2.5 or up to 3% inflation, since inflation is so sticky and the numbers don't seem to want to go down much below the high twos? So this is where we are today, and I think you're going to hear a lot more about this debate in the future.
Well, if the 2% target might not be realistic, what is the realistic expectation by the Federal Reserve and how far can it be?
Yeah, well, of course, the idea is to convince the Federal Reserve that 2% isn't realistic anymore, and we're not there yet. Most well-established economists believe that somewhere between 2.5% and 3 is a perfectly livable number. Right now, we've got problems in food, we've got problems in housing, we've got problems with costs of automobiles. But these can be brought under control. The question really is, what should the policy be? And that is what we're talking about now.
Then how should the Fed address the core inflation, which is expected to rise slightly year on year?
Yeah, right. Good question. So the point is that in order to address it, it would have to stop cutting interest rates. And this is what the big debate is on for next year, because cutting interest rates encourages people to spend, which is inherently inflationary. So that's what they have got to decide. I mean, if they believe that inflation is still a problem and is too sticky, then we'll be looking at either fewer or no cuts starting in January.
What about the investors? What should they expect from Jerome Powell's press conference following the meeting? What signs should they look for regarding a slower pace of rate cuts or even a potential pause in January?
Right. Everything about, from the investor point of view, is about expectations. As I mentioned earlier, it's a 90% plus that the Fed is going to reduce inflations by 25 basis points next week. That is baked in, so the market and investors shouldn't be concerned about it. They should be concerned about the outlook for next year, because if the Fed starts giving hints that cuts are over, that will have a negative effect on the markets and, of course, a negative effect for investors, at least short term.
Then how can the Federal Reserve balance supporting the economic momentum while managing the inflation risks? What challenges do they face given the current economic environment?
A lot of them, to answer your question briefly. The Fed's mandate is inflation and full employment. The employment numbers are good and they're pretty steady. Inflation remains a bit of a concern, although it's come down greatly from the heights of the pandemic. The Fed needs to balance these two so that if it keeps cutting when it ought not to, that would exacerbate inflation. It's very conscious of this. But the Fed doesn't forecast. What it really does is base its decisions on the data at the time it makes those decisions. So we'll all have to sit back and see what it's likely to be like in the coming months.